Welcome. I'm Paul Robichaux, the CTO from Quadrotech. I'm getting started a little bit early because I have a lot to say. And I'm going to preface it by saying, if you have more questions, and you probably will because this is going to be a fast-paced presentation, I'm going to be in booth 841 for the rest of the afternoon. So come over and talk to us. My product manager who owns our tenant-to-tenant line is going to be there. And I'd like to talk to you about both your technical and non-technical challenges around tenant-to-tenant. So a quick agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about the business landscape that underlies tenant-to-tenant and then dive into understanding what the technical and non-technical challenges or pitfalls that you're going to face are, and hopefully give you some tools to equip you to not fall victim to those as you go through your migrations. So quick show of hands. How many of you are currently doing a tenant-to-tenant migration? Wow, okay. How many of you have already done one? All right. How many of you would rather be on the beach right now? Yeah, that's what I figured. Nobody likes tenant-to-tenant, right? It's not a popular topic because it's difficult. But business is forcing us to do this, right? $1.9 trillion of merger and acquisition activity forecast for 2019. I haven't seen the 2020 forecast, but it's going to be higher. The problem is, as IT people, we get handed these requirements. Somebody walks into your office and says, boom, we are buying Contoso. Boom, we're buying Fox. Oh, guess what? Now you have a problem. Nobody asked you if it was a good idea. Nobody consulted with you about the IT implications. They just said, we're going to do this, now you need to make it happen. So from an IT perspective, the kinds of things that we worry about are, how are we going to meet our responsibilities to stakeholders? How are we going to get the job done, given that ultimately what the business wants is going to dictate how things have to go? Very quick vocabulary. You're going to hear me use these terms at different times to talk about different scenarios. I'm going to flash this up here really quick and be quiet for about 10 seconds to let you read it, and then we're going to drive on. All right, close enough. The key thing to think about, out of all those workloads or all those activities that you saw listed on the previous slide, Microsoft does not have tools to help you with all of those. Okay, I want to be really clear. There's some activities, are any of you currently running multi-geo or need to run multi-geo? Okay, have any of you gone through a Go Local exercise where you took data back into a sovereign data center in, I don't know, France or Germany, China, someplace like that? Okay, then you know Microsoft can do those things, but you can't do them for yourself. Everything else, mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, you have to do those yourself because Microsoft doesn't give you tools to do them. This basic workflow is what we see every tenant-to-tenant project go through, whether it's a merger, acquisition, or divestiture. I mentioned earlier that Mike Weaver from Quadrotech is the product owner who owns this product. I stole this from him, so thank you, Mike. But you're going to see this same basic flow repeated every single time you go through one of these operations. The flow may not have every step every time. For example, if you're not doing a divestiture, you probably don't want to actually destroy any data when you get done. Bad move, I don't recommend it. But you're always going to need to analyze the data that you have, segment it to figure out who's going to move when, what data will move, where it will go, apply compliance, take the data out of its source, put the data into where it belongs, and then this cleanup step of throwing away anything you don't really need to keep. This is a really high level view. There are a lot of individual steps when you double click on any of these. Because, for example, when you're complying, that's a really good time for you to go through and see if you have old data or stuff that you don't need, right? If it's obsolete, if it's garbage that you don't need to keep, don't move it. The minute you move it, it becomes a compliance issue that you now have to keep track of and maintain and audit and so on. So a quick survey of some of the technical challenges that you're going to face. Identity management is the first one. Without an identity in the target tenant, you can't do anything. Users can't log in. So how do you get there? Are you going to synchronize identities somehow using somebody else's tool? Are you going to use Microsoft's new Active Directory Sync service, which is a service that you buy from MCS? It is not a product. It's not something you get through the portal. You actually have to have MCS move into your house and eat everything in the refrigerator on an ongoing basis to get this synchronization. Maybe you're going to go greenfield and set up a new set of identities. That's literally the first thing that you need to figure out because you can't do anything else until that's done. Then the fun starts after that. What workloads are you moving? Are they all supported? For example, maybe you're moving from a commercial tenant to GCC. Is the workload that you need to use, or the workloads that you need, supported in the target? How are you going to do the migration? A very popular way to do it for smaller tenants is to do a cutover where you migrate out and then you migrate in. That may not work for a large tenant. You may have to decide, how am I going to do things like namespace coexistence for mail flow? That's probably the hardest unsolved problem in tenant-to-tenant right now, and you're not going to be able to solve it unless you have an SMTP management tool from somebody like Proofpoint at this point. Data classification and labeling. How are you going to label your data? Are you going to label your data? Have you thought about any of this labeling and classification stuff? Wouldn't it be nice if you could go through and pre-classify and pre-label everything in the source tenants before your migration? Timing and throughput. Who's going to move? When are they going to move? And how long is it going to take to move them? Remember that first box that I had in Mike's flow talks about analyzing your environment. You can't analyze, or sorry, if you don't analyze, then you can't plan for how long it will take to move a particular tenant or a particular group, because you won't know how big it is. You won't know how much data is represented by those users in their mailboxes, in their SharePoint-owned files, in OneDrive, and so on. Now guess what? That's just the first page of technical challenges, because there are more. Anytime you migrate users from one place to another, you have to configure their endpoint. How many of you in the past have done Active Directory domain consolidation or domain transfers? How many of you would like to do that again? Oh, come on, somebody raise their hand. You must be a consultant. It's hard, and it's worse with Office, because when you think about what happens with the Office identity, that's where the clients are licensed. That's where all the ownership and credentials live for every file that that user is allowed to see, every piece of email in her OST file. That's all tied to the Office identity. And Microsoft doesn't have good tools to scorch the old identity and let the user log in again with their tenant, which means there's a whole bunch of embedded workflow that you have to do, or Quadrotech will do for you, to make the experience work right. So the user could just log in with her UPN and get her stuff. Mobile devices. You cannot do a tenant-to-tenant migration without supporting your users' mobile devices, or they will throw you out the window. Everybody uses mobile these days. Domain management, I already alluded to that from a mail flow and coexistence standpoint. And then finally, this last thing, nobody wants to talk about post-migration cleanup. Imagine what the staff at the convention center here has to do to clean up after Ignite, and you start to get an idea of what it feels like. We all get to go to Universal, and then we get to go home. They have to stay here and pick up all the trash and the leftover booth swag and the banana peels. And that is a step. That is part of your migration that you're going to have to plan for. Now that's just the technical stuff. The non-technical problems, I'm going to argue, are actually harder, and these are the ones where investing up front will pay off by saving you time and giving you a smoother path. The first and probably most important one is ownership. Every step in your migration journey should have a RACI assignment. For those of you that haven't seen it before, RACI stands for who is responsible, who is accountable, who is consulted, and who is informed. For everything that you do during the migration, you better be able to answer those 4 questions for every step. That way you can make sure that everybody who's supposed to do something does it, and everybody who's supposed to know something knows about it. I'm not even going to get into the question of who does the work, right? When Disney buys Fox or Amazon buys Whole Foods, somebody actually has to carry out the migration, and negotiating that is really important, especially if you are a smaller company being bought by a larger one. They may want you to do the work, and you may not be staffed for it. Okay, identity management. Why is this here again? Because the non-technical aspects of identity management, if anything, are worse than the technical aspects. Are you going to keep your old domain and let people log in with either domain suffix? Maybe. Are you going to rewrite everybody's email address? So right now I'm paul@quadro.tech. If Microsoft buys this, I'm not going to be paul@microsoft.com. They're going to make me be like PROJ77 or something. Right? So now I have the challenge of communicating that email address to people, which means the people who would own that hypothetical migration have got to have a plan to communicate to the users what they're supposed to do. And then finally, the finished state. One of the guys on my team is getting married on Saturday, which is why he's not enjoying the Ignite goodness with all of us. And he was telling me the other day, as part of the wedding planning, he and his fiancée have gone through all these negotiations about, okay, I have a toaster and you have a toaster. We only need one toaster. Which one do we keep? For toasters, it's easy. But imagine I have a recliner that I'm sentimentally attached to, and you have an armchair that you're sentimentally attached to, but we only have space for one. You would be amazed at how often this kind of discussion derails or screws up migration projects, not because there is a technical reason about doing things one way or another, but because people get emotionally attached to things like their standards for naming meeting rooms, right? I name my meeting rooms after superheroes. No, that's completely wrong. I name them after mountains. Meeting rooms, mountains. I mean, grown people actually get into shouting arguments about this stuff. It's crazy. But if you don't have a plan to decide who gets to decide, you're going to get rocked. It's going to be a problem. Okay, next up, the definition of done. If I can give you one piece of advice, besides buy low and sell high, it would be have an agreement early on what it means for the migration to be done. Does done mean that you moved all the data and screw the users? No. Does done mean that every user can log into her desktop and get every data item and every service that she had before the migration? Those are the two extremes, right? Either I move the data and you're on your own, or everything is exactly like it was the day before. You may decide that somewhere in between is acceptable, or you may not. That's a business decision. It's not up to you as the IT executor to decide that. Your users and the business users are going to decide that, but you better make sure you're participating in that decision so that you can weigh in. Business impact assessment. This is a fancy way to say, what happens if something breaks? What if your migration is late? What if you think you can migrate stream data, which you can't, by the way, there's no API for that. What if you're planning on being able to migrate all your videos from stream and you find out you can't, and the business comes back and says, holy cow, IT guy, you just cost us $1 billion zillion because we don't have our stream videos. That's a business impact, and now you have to figure out a way to patch that hole. How are you going to do that? The time to decide how to patch the hole is not when you're in the hole looking up at the sky wondering how you're going to get out. Okay, and then everybody's favorite IT phrase, garbage in, garbage out. You cannot just pull the ripcord and start a migration and let it run through to the end and then think, oh yeah, maybe I should check to make sure that all the files got migrated or all the email is there. But before you even do a small pilot, you have to understand and decide on what your metrics are. How will I know if a mailbox migration was successful? How will I know if a OneDrive or Teams migration is successful? Okay, I don't care. You probably don't care, but your users are going to care, and you need to be able to go to them proactively and tell them the migration is done and a user is successfully migrated when she has all of her calendar data. She has all of her email data for 6 months. She is able to log into and carry out a Teams chat. Okay? That would be a bare bones definition, but you see where I'm going. You have to drive that standard and make sure that the business people are on board so that everybody is in agreement on what's getting done. And then, of course, you probably only thought there were 2 pages of challenges, but sorry. How many of you have been on a cruise before? Okay, for those of you who have, you'll know what I'm talking about. For those of you who haven't, every week or every 3 days or whatever, the cruise ship pulls into port and somebody takes off all the eggshells and coffee grounds and garbage, and they bring on 13,000 pounds of butter and 14,000 eggs or whatever. And for the crew, it's the same old, but for the passengers, it's a brand new day. So on day 1 of the cruise, there's always a line of people at the service desk. Hey, my hot water doesn't work. Hey, the phone's broken. Hey, I don't know where the Lido deck is. You're going to have that problem if you're doing a large migration. On day 1, for every individual group of users you are migrating, remember, for them, it's the first day. For you, it's the 10th group you've moved. You have to make sure that your support team and your support infrastructure is staffed and able to handle that, especially if you're doing a big cutover migration. We're working on one right now where in March, we're going to be cutting over the last 7,500 users of a 130,000 user company. Until then, we're doing them in 1,000, 2,000 batches, and that's okay. But when that 7,500 user big bang hits, the support team has had to adjust their hours and their call schedules to make sure that they have enough people to handle the volume of support calls for day one, really days 1 through 5. That first week, support volume is going to drop down as everybody gets settled into the new environment. Oh, what else do we have to talk about? Legal hold. You know, I hate even talking about this, but if you have it now, you're going to have it later. Plan for that. Plan for mean questions or unpleasant questions from your legal and compliance people about what you are doing and whether you can prove that an item that was held over here is still held over here. Because if you can't do that, you know what's going to happen? When the judge bangs her gavel and says, produce these records, the legal department is going to look at you and say, what happened to that data that we used to have in the old tenant? You would probably want to be able to answer that question and tell them where that data is. Or maybe not, maybe you like adventure. Okay, tenant settings for things like federation. This is sort of a variation on the whose toaster problem. So if I have customer lockbox enabled in my company and you buy me, do you have customer lockbox enabled? Do you need it? I don't know, that's a business decision. What settings from the tenant are going to be allowed to carry over? It gets worse for consolidation. If you have a bunch of tenants that all have their own settings and you're smashing them into one, what you'll find over and over is, hey, these people are depending on having a feature available that is not licensed or enabled in the new tenant. Very common scenario. But there will be other situations like this where some responsible adult, or you, if there isn't a responsible adult around, has to decide how you're going to decide which tenant settings you keep and which ones you say, no, we don't do that anymore. This last bullet I put up, I don't know how many of you have had the experience of buying a home, but my son and his girlfriend just bought their first house. And you could see the terror in their faces when they got the keys and the realtor said, congratulations, Tom and Shauna, on your new home. They were like, oh my God, I own a house. I don't know how to own a house. I don't know how to be an adult who owns a house. And the same thing will happen during these migrations, right? You will consolidate 2 tenants into one, and now, oh my God, I bought a tenant, right? You now have a bigger tenant that has more stuff in it, and you will never entirely, or I won't say never, it will take a while for you to lose that feeling of fear that maybe there was something that didn't get migrated or that isn't working quite right. It will pass in time, probably just in time for you to have to migrate another tenant, right? How many of you routinely or regularly do merger and acquisition activities at your companies? Okay, so you know what I mean, right? Your company will buy a competitor, or they'll buy somebody this week, and you'll get the tenant migrated, and everything will be cool, and then in 6 months, your boss will come back and say, oh yeah, by the way, we bought this other company, and it's back to square one. So the good news is, if you do this often enough, right, it's like heart surgery. If I ever have to have heart surgery, I want to go to the most experienced, oldest, crustiest surgeon I can find who does this kind of thing 10 times a day. I don't want to go see the kid who's fresh out of medical school and can barely spell heart, right? So if you're doing this routinely, you will see many of these challenges seem less frightening. But never forget, there's a first time and a second time and a third time for everybody who has to do this, right? And so it can be kind of daunting. So how do you make it go smoothly? Well, there are a few general principles that I've tried to share throughout the presentation so far. But if I had to sum them up, these are the ones that I would recommend to you. Know who is responsible for every step of the migration: process, technology, tooling, and people. For everything that you do, there should be one person's name next to it. Not a committee, not a team, not a business unit, but some dude down the hall where you can go to his office and say, hey, this is broken. I need you to help me fix it. Oh, come on, seriously? Okay, I'm just going to keep talking. Be ruthless about scope. You really have to hold tight to your scoping and make sure that the business does not try to sneak things in at the last minute. Suppose you have a migration plan where you've said, I'm going to migrate Mail and Teams and OneDrive, and the business comes screeching in at the last minute and go, oh yeah, I just found out the CEO really loves Planner and you have to migrate all her Planner data. It's okay to say no. It really is. It'll be hard. especially the first time, especially if you're talking to somebody who's way above you on the food chain, but I promise you can do it. I believe in you, I know you can. And you're going to have to, because the minute you start allowing scope creep, think of scope creep like a real person, right? He's that guy in the raincoat who's looking in your windows. When the scope creep comes to your office and starts looking in your window, you got to get rid of him immediately or he will never leave. The first time you allow a broader scope will not be the last time. Okay? The more time you spend in the analysis phase, the more you measure early, the better off you'll be. Know what you have to move, know who's going to be affected, know what the business impact is, and have plans to deal with things when they go wrong. That's all planning. You can do that with pencil and paper or Visio or a napkin and a bar. It doesn't require any technology, it doesn't require tools. But the more time you spend up front doing that, the easier and smoother your migration experience will be. You cannot over-communicate to users. Hey, I'm moving you in 2 months. Hey, I'm moving you next month. Hey, I'm moving you in 2 weeks. Hey, this Friday you're going to move. Hey, I moved you. That would be an appropriate sequence of communications to have with your users, to tell them early on, get their concerns, get the potential problems out of the way as quickly as you can. And then lastly, you have got to absolutely bring your most ironclad, muscular Arnold Schwarzenegger project management game. You have got to be able to track everything that you do and account for how long it's going to take and know what's done and what isn't. Now, Quadrotech has a couple of resources to help. I know you can't write these URLs down, but you can see them in the recording. Or you can come by our booth, booth 841. I've talked so much that I don't have time for questions, but I'm going to stick around here for a few minutes, and then I'll be in the booth along with Mike and the rest of our staff for the rest of the day. So thank you very much for coming. Good luck with your migrations. Enjoy the party tonight.